The corridors of Caligula's palace were not filled with debate or politics. They pulsed with whispers, sobs, and the ragged cries of those begging for mercy. Torchlight flickered across marble walls once built to honor Rome's glory, now witness to its decay. The air reeked of incense and fear. Under the rule of the young emperor, Rome's elite discovered a new hierarchy, one built not on power or lineage, but on humiliation. Fathers who once boasted of honor now bartered away their daughters to survive another day. Senators, draped in white togas of dignity, applauded through trembling hands as their wives were paraded before the emperor like offerings to a living god. What unfolded inside those marble chambers was not chaos. It was a system. Each act of cruelty had a method, a form, a price. Everything was written down. The empire's clerks kept ledgers of pain, as if suffering itself were a taxable commodity. To those outside, Rome still gleamed. The temples stood, the aqueducts flowed, and statues of gods still watched over the city. But within the palace walls, the emperor had crafted something far more enduring than architecture. He had built a machine of obedience. Mercy had become irrelevant. Morality had been monetized. Every cry, every broken vow, every ruined family was converted into currency that fed the empire's golden beast. Caligula didn't see himself as a man. He saw himself as a god perfecting creation through degradation. In his mind, Rome's greatness was not in its armies or its laws, but in its submission, the absolute surrender of body and will to his divine authority. His cruelty was not random. It was ritual. When fathers signed documents consigning their children to the emperor's service, they did so beneath banners of Rome's eagle, a symbol now twisted into mockery. At night, the palace glowed red under lamplight, its windows trembling with the echoes of screams and laughter that merged into something neither human nor divine. Guards stood motionless, pretending not to hear. Servants learned to move silently, their faces expressionless, their eyes fixed on the floor. And above it all sat Caligula, the emperor who had found a way to turn depravity into law and terror into economy. What began as whispers of mercy became the gospel of survival. Rome, once the city of gods, now knelt before a man who had made himself their god, a god of cruelty, bureaucracy, and blood. Before the palace became a place of screams, there had been laughter. Rome once sang Caligula's name with joy. The city that would one day tremble before him first welcomed him as its savior, a young man born of a heroic bloodline, the beloved son of Germanicus, the general who had carried Rome's eagle into distant lands and returned victorious. They called him Caligula, Little Boots, a nickname from the soldiers who had adored him as a child wandering through the camps in miniature armor. When Emperor Tiberius died, the people rejoiced as if a curse had been lifted. The senators who had lived in terror under Tiberius's suspicion now dared to smile again. They hailed Caligula as the dawn of a new age, the return of virtue, mercy, and the glory of the old republic. His coronation was celebrated for 100 days. Musicians played in the streets, temples overflowed with offerings, and gold dust was thrown into the air like sunlight. The empire felt reborn. Caligula seemed to embody everything Rome had longed for. He cut taxes that had bled the provinces dry, freed those imprisoned for political dissent, restored property to exiled families, and greeted the legions with kindness. In public he laughed easily, lifted children into his arms, and addressed commoners as though they were friends. Women threw flowers at his chariot wheels, crying his name like a hymn. Even the Senate, so often cynical, believed that the gods had sent them a prince of peace. The contrast with Tiberius was striking. Where Tiberius had hidden himself away on the island of Capri, lost in paranoia and cruelty, Caligula walked among his people. He attended games, shared meals with senators, and watched plays with soldiers. His charm was effortless, his gestures divine. The city glowed again under his presence, but Rome, ever hungry for spectacle, did not see the shadows forming behind his smile. In his public generosity, there lingered something unsettling, a hunger not for love but for control. He watched the cheers not with gratitude but with fascination, as if testing how easily a crowd could be moved, how completely their devotion could be turned. At the height of his adoration, he whispered to a confidant, "They love me as a man today, but soon they will worship me as a god." No one understood the warning hidden in his words. The celebration continued, the flowers still fell, and the city still sang his name. But behind that golden dawn, the first cracks of madness had begun to gleam, bright as sunlight on the blade of a knife. The change came like a storm that no one could see until it was too late. In the autumn of 37 CE, the Golden Prince who had once healed Rome fell violently ill. His body burned with a fever so fierce that priests slaughtered oxen and lambs daily, offering prayers to Jupiter and Apollo for mercy. The people fasted and wept in the streets, believing that if Caligula died, Rome's light would die with him. For weeks he drifted between life and death, raving in delirium, eyes glazed, whispering to the ceiling as though gods hovered above his bed. Then, one morning, he awoke, but what opened its eyes was not the same man Rome had loved. The fever had not killed him. It had burned something human out of him. The warmth, the laughter, the light in his gaze were gone. What replaced them was something hollow, divine and terrible. His first decree stunned the empire. Every statue of every god in Rome was to have its head replaced with his own likeness. Jupiter, Mars, Apollo. All were remade in the image of Gaius Caesar. The sculptors worked through the night, chipping away the faces of gods to fit the emperors. Rome's temples turned into mirrors of his madness. At night, Caligula roamed the palace barefoot, wrapped in a white shroud, his laurel crown askew, muttering to the moon as if it were an oracle. Guards saw him speaking to marble statues as though they answered back. In the gardens he knelt in the soil, hands black with earth, whispering that he was planting the seeds of Rome's eternal destiny. Servants found him at dawn, trembling, eyes wild, claiming Jupiter had spoken to him and promised dominion over gods and men alike. Those who dared to look closely noticed how his body told the truth, his words could not. His once youthful face had grown gaunt. His eyes no longer blinked like mortal eyes. They stared too long, too still. And when he smiled, it was not with joy but with revelation, the certainty that he was chosen. The empire began to bow in confusion. Priests, fearing execution, addressed him not as princeps but as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. And Caligula accepted the title with serene satisfaction. The man who had once healed Rome now sought to remake it in his divine image. And from the ashes of his fever, a god had awoken, and a god of cruelty, vanity, and madness, whose kingdom would soon run red with devotion. Caligula's madness did not strike Rome all at once. It began quietly within his own blood. His three sisters, Drusilla, Julia Livilla, and Agrippina the Younger, were the first to feel the reach of his divinity. To Caligula they were not family. They were celestial extensions of himself, divine vessels that existed to orbit his growing godhood. Of them all, Drusilla was his chosen. He called her his Diana, his living goddess. At public ceremonies, he seated her beside him upon a throne meant for empresses. She shared his feasts, his chambers, and his authority. Rome whispered behind closed doors, but no one dared to speak the word incest. When Drusilla died in 38 CE, the emperor's grief tore through the empire like a plague. He declared her a goddess and demanded worship in her name, Diva Drusilla. For 40 days, laughter was outlawed. To smile was treason. To bathe was defiance. Meals were eaten in silence, and families whispered prayers instead of speaking. Those who dared to show joy were executed publicly. But this mourning was not love, it was ownership. Drusilla's death had not broken his heart. It had wounded his control. The fury that followed was godlike in its cruelty. He turned his gaze to the women of Rome's most powerful houses, the wives and daughters of senators, generals, and priests. Under the guise of divine ritual, they were summoned to the palace. There, in chambers lit with gold and incense, Caligula sat upon his throne of ivory and bronze, observing as forced unions unfolded before him. He did not participate. He directed. A scribe at his side recorded every detail: who hesitated, who submitted, who cried, who pretended to smile. Those lists became weapons. A senator whose wife appeared too willing found his property seized. Another whose daughter resisted lost his son to execution. The message was clear. In Caligula's Rome there were no innocents. Only participants and corpses. Every act became currency. The emperor's notes determined careers, fortunes, and fates. Senators bribed priests for absolution. Fathers traded their daughters to preserve their estates. Even the imperial guards watched in silence, their loyalty purchased by fear. Rome's moral spine cracked. What had once been the beating heart of the Republic became a stage for Caligula's divine theatre. A world where humiliation replaced justice, and obedience was the only form of survival. The man who had once promised Rome a golden age now ruled through spectacle and sin. And in the glow of torchlight, the blood of the divine began to flow. Not from gods, but from the innocent lives that worship demanded. By the year 39 CE, the palace no longer resembled a home. It had become an institution. What should have been a residence for an emperor now functioned as a cathedral to corruption, meticulously designed and efficiently managed. Caligula's madness had evolved beyond cruelty. It had taken form, blueprints, schedules, and ledgers. He didn't simply want to be worshipped. He wanted his depravity to have architecture. Marble corridors once meant for senators and ambassadors now bore new names. The Room of Jupiter, a chamber where the emperor played God, presiding over ritualized violations disguised as divine blessings. The Chamber of Venus, a sanctum for forced ceremonies performed by noblewomen dressed in translucent Syrian silks so thin they shimmered under torchlight. And the Hall of Priapus, a place of punishments where men of rank were humiliated before the emperor's priests, their dignity stripped as part of a sacred trial. Every wall was painted with frescoes of gods committing acts once confined to myth, each bearing Caligula's own face. What had once been moral depravity had now become doctrine. The emperor himself called it the temple of flesh. No one was immune. Senators' wives, merchants' daughters, even temple maidens were summoned in the name of divine service. Girls as young as 12 were told they had been chosen by Jupiter's living vessel. The phrase became a death sentence, delivered with ceremony. The administration of sin was systematic. Each woman was catalogued: name, age, family, physical condition. Physicians and scribes worked side by side, recording every detail on parchment. Rates were standardized, just like taxes. 16 tercios for a knight's wife, 2,000 for a virgin daughter, 5,000 for both. Voluntary contributions to the state. The empire's treasury grew as the people's souls shrank. The emperor's courtiers learned to smile as they documented the unthinkable. Gold flowed through Rome's temples and markets, buying silence from those who benefited. Priests blessed the ceremonies. Accountants tallied the profits. No act of defiance went unpunished, and no act of complicity went unrewarded. Caligula had succeeded where no tyrant before him had dared. He transformed desire into bureaucracy. Pleasure became paperwork. Violation became ritual. He stood at the center of it all, a living god enthroned in marble and silk, surrounded by incense and ledgers. The palace was no longer a place, it was a system, one built to turn worship into obedience, faith into profit, and the human body into Rome's newest currency. Caligula's empire of flesh soon turned its gaze toward something colder: legacy. The emperor who had built temples to his depravity now sought to control life itself. Pleasure no longer satisfied him. What he wanted was power over blood, the ability to sculpt generations in his own divine image. He summoned physicians and midwives from every corner of the empire. Their task was not to heal but to classify. Women were examined like livestock, their fertility tested, their bodies measured, their lineage recorded in scrolls. Those deemed favorable were compelled to conceive children in the emperor's name. Pregnancy became a public duty, an offering to the living god. And when those children were born, they were taken away before their mothers could speak their names. The newborns were declared property of the state, Caligula's offspring in spirit, even when not in blood. He called it the Imperial Generation Program. In truth, it was a breeding machine, one designed to erase the line between family and empire. Each child's fate was written before they could walk. Boys were trained to serve as attendants in the palace, stripped of identity. Their hair perfumed, their faces painted in white and vermilion. Clad in saffron tunics, they were taught to move with grace, to smile without emotion, to bow at a gesture. They were not children. They were ornaments of obedience. The nobles understood the warning. Husbands were ordered to witness their wives' humiliation as sacred ritual. Fathers were forced to sign decrees consenting to their daughters' divine service. To refuse was treason. One man dared, Senator Cornelius. When the emperor demanded his wife Libya, he stood in the Senate and said no. The chamber froze. For a heartbeat, hope flickered that anyone might defy the god. The next morning, Cornelius found his 8-year-old son on the marble steps of the Senate, still alive, mutilated beyond recognition. Carved into the child's flesh were the words, "Let no man defy his God." That afternoon, Cornelius delivered his wife to the palace gates. From that day, no man refused. The Senate voted to rewrite Roman law itself. It was decreed that any child fathered by the emperor, by any woman of any station, would be considered a legitimate heir, a divine birth by decree. In that single act, Rome's morality dissolved. Bloodlines no longer belonged to families. They belonged to the throne, and the empire learned that under Caligula, even birth could be legislated, and innocence could be taxed. Every empire needs order, even in its nightmares. Caligula's new Rome did not run on passion or chaos, but on documentation. Beneath the Palatine Hill, the emperor built his most efficient creation, a bureaucracy of horror. In the underground chambers, thousands of scrolls lined the walls, cataloguing the lives and bodies of his victims. Each parchment bore the same cold structure: name, age, social rank, duration, acts performed, injuries recorded, pregnancies confirmed, payments made. Every scream had a price. Every humiliation was filed like a financial entry. Hundreds of clerks, guards, and midwives labored night after night under torchlight, their quills scratching over blood-stained ledgers. Each believed that by keeping perfect records, they kept themselves safe. It was said that Caligula visited the archive often. He would walk between rows of shelves, running his fingers across the scrolls, smiling faintly at the order of it all. Here, suffering was not tragedy, and it was efficiency. The empire's depravity had become an industry, and on nights of the full moon the records were not enough. Caligula transformed his private amphitheater into a temple of spectacle, a fusion of blood and ritual. The marble floor was polished like glass, the torches arranged in perfect symmetry. Gladiators, prisoners, and beasts were chosen as sacred participants. At the emperor's command, senators and nobles filled the stands, forced to watch in silence as their wives and daughters performed before them. The emperor presided above it all with his gilded baton, its handle carved into obscene symbols of his so-called divinity. With a wave of that baton, he dictated the pace of each scene: who lived, who fell, who bled, who was blessed. It was not entertainment. It was choreography, a divine theater of control. Outside, Rome profited. Apothecaries sold ointments to heal the wounds of survivors. Doctors offered secret restorations for those marked by the rituals. Poets wrote verses glorifying the emperor's sacred ceremonies, while discreet abortionists and undertakers grew rich from the unending demand. Every profession learned its role in the machinery of sin. Even silence had value. Those who said nothing prospered. Those who questioned disappeared into the archive, reduced to ink and numbers, and so the empire thrived, not in glory, but in documentation. The marble halls that once echoed with oratory now whispered only with quills and coins. In Rome under Caligula, atrocity had become policy. Cruelty had become commerce, and pain itself had found its accountant. By 41 CE, resistance had become a forgotten word in Rome. The emperor's will was law, and his desires were sacred decree. Those who tried to flee his rituals found no escape, only new forms of punishment. Some women swallowed poison, hoping to die before being summoned again. Others cut their faces with knives or burned their own skin, believing that ugliness might spare them. But Caligula declared that disfigurement only purified the ritual. The gods, he said, are not tempted by beauty, they are fed by obedience. Even suicide lost its freedom. Victims who failed to die were revived by imperial physicians, paraded half alive before the court, and displayed as warnings. Caligula's reign had become a sermon of terror. He believed himself untouchable, the living embodiment of Jupiter, immune to mortal hands. Yet the vengeance destined for him grew not among slaves or senators, but within his own guards, the men sworn to protect him. Among them was Cassius Chaerea, a praetorian officer once respected, now broken by humiliation. Caligula had mocked him publicly, calling him effeminate, forcing him to give obscene watchwords during guard duty. Each insult carved deeper into his pride until rage became the only prayer he knew. On January 24, 41 CE, the emperor prepared for another spectacle, a final display of his divine authority. When it ended, he left the amphitheater through an underground corridor beneath the Palatine Palace, laughing, surrounded by a handful of attendants. The torches flickered against the marble walls as footsteps echoed behind him. Then came the sound of steel. Gyria struck first, his blade tearing through the white and gold of the emperor's robe. Others followed, praetorians who had once bowed before him, now consumed by their own shame. The blades rose and fell in a frenzy, stabbing him dozens of times. One thrust drove deep into his groin, the cruelest of symbols, a reflection of his crimes. When it was over, the god lay broken in the dark, his blood pooling on the marble floor like spilled wine. His wife Caesonia and their infant daughter were executed shortly after. Rome, drunk on fear, exhaled for the first time in years. The Senate declared damnatio memoriae, the erasure of his name. Statues were toppled, coins melted, inscriptions chiseled away. But paper and pain remember what marble forgets. The ledgers survived. The scars remained. And from those pages of torment, Rome learned a truth it could never erase: that cruelty, once organized, can outlive the monster who created it. For even when gods fall, their systems endure. And manuals of horror once written never truly die.